All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving headfirst into a story that could have some serious global ripple effects.
Definitely some high stakes here.
We're talking about China and the way they seem to be, well, almost fixated on how the West dealt with Russia's moves.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch unfold, that's for sure.
And you might be thinking, okay, but how does this actually affect me?
Right. What's the takeaway for the average person?
Well, imagine for a second your smartphone suddenly becoming about as powerful as, like, an iPhone 1.
Ooh, yeah, I see where you're going with this. Not good.
That's the kind of tech downgrade we could be looking at if things go south between China and Taiwan.
And that's not even the half of it. We're talking massive economic shockwaves, potential military standoffs, and a whole lot of unknowns.
So where are we getting all this from?
Well, our deep dive today is built on a Telegraph article all about Chinese officials studying how those Western sanctions hit Russia. Plus, we've got some spicy commentary from a Reddit thread discussing the article.
So we get to see how people are reacting to this in real time.
Exactly. It's like taking the pulse of public opinion.
I love that. So this isn't just some niche topic, huh?
Not at all. This thing's got global implications because it boils down to the balance of power on a worldwide scale.
All right, so let's break it down. We've established that China's been watching how the West reacted to Russia. But what are they actually doing about it?
Well, according to the Telegraph, China sent a team straight to the Russian central bank to get a first-hand look at the whole sanctions situation.
Like a fact-finding mission.
You got it. They wanted to understand how the sanctions actually worked, the impact they had, and any potential ways to, get around them.
So is it fair to say they're using Russia as a test case, maybe even a dress rehearsal, for what could happen if they decide to make a move on Taiwan?
A lot of experts seem to think so, especially considering the timing. Back in 2022, China went ahead and formed a whole task force focused on analyzing the effects of sanctions.
Wow, so they're not messing around. Sounds like they're putting together a whole playbook based on what happened to Russia.
It's looking that way. And one of the biggest lessons they seem to have taken away is the whole idea of de-dollarization.
De-dollarization, that's a mouthful. Remind me what that is again?
Basically, it means they're trying to rely less on the US dollar, trying to create their own financial systems that wouldn't be as vulnerable if the West slapped them with sanctions.
So, like, their own financial safety net.
You got it. And that's just one strategy. They're also looking at boosting domestic industries, especially in areas where they're heavily reliant on imports.
Makes sense. Becoming more self-reliant, less vulnerable to outside pressure.
Exactly. Building a system where they can weather any storm, even if the global economy goes haywire.
This is getting intense. It's like a high-stakes game of chess. But I gotta ask, why is Taiwan the center of all this? Why all the focus on this one island?
Well, Taiwan plays a unique and honestly critical role in how the global economy works. They're the world's top producer of advanced semiconductors.
Those tiny chips that power everything, right? Phones, cars, even military tech.
You got it. So if China were to take control of Taiwan, they'd basically have a monopoly on this crucial industry.
Uh-oh. I'm starting to see why people are worried.
Yeah, the Reddit thread was buzzing with concerns about what this kind of control would mean for the world. One user even said China would be able to, and I quote, grab the world by the balls.
Wow. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah.
So it's not just about political power. It's about dominating the global economy.
Exactly. Control of Taiwan would give them a massive advantage in a world that's increasingly reliant on technology.
Okay, let me recap here. We've got China potentially eyeing Taiwan, which has this incredibly valuable resource. And they're studying Russia's whole sanctions experience to figure out how to avoid the same pain. What's the next chapter in this story?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The potential consequences here are huge, both for China and for the rest of the world, and that's what we're going to unpack next.
I am ready. Let's talk about those consequences. What kind of fallout are we looking at if China actually decides to make a move?
Well, economically, it could be absolutely devastating. China has trillions, with a T, trillions of dollars in foreign reserves.
That's an insane amount of money.
It is, and a lot of that could be frozen by Western sanctions. Plus, there was a report from the Atlantic Council and Rhodium Group that estimated trillions in Chinese assets overseas could be vulnerable.
Okay, yeah, that's not good. So even if China thinks they can handle the sanctions, there would still be major economic fallout.
Oh, absolutely. And we haven't even touched on the possibility of things escalating militarily. The Telegraph article even mentioned China's vow to use resolute countermeasures after the U.S. approved arms shipments to Taiwan.
Resolute countermeasures, what does that even mean?
Basically, it's China's way of saying, we're not backing down. They're prepared to respond, maybe even with force if they feel threatened.
So this could get real messy real fast. But wait, didn't Russia's economy actually do better than expected under those sanctions? Could China be hoping for the same outcome?
That's a great question, and a lot of people are debating that very point. While Russia's economy did initially hold up better than some predictions, the situation has taken a turn recently. The ruble has tanked, hitting its lowest point since the invasion of Ukraine.
Why the sudden drop? What happened?
Well, it's a mix of things. The long-term impact of those sanctions on key industries, foreign companies pulling out, and the rising costs of the war itself. Basically, that initial resilience is starting to crumble.
So it's not exactly a success story that China can confidently replicate.
Nope. And a lot of those Reddit users picked up on that too. They pointed out that Russia and China have very different economic structures. What worked for one might not work for the other. Plus, the global response to a Taiwan conflict would probably be much stronger simply because of how important Taiwan is to the tech world.
Okay, so this is way more complicated and volatile than it might seem at first glance.
You got it. And that's why understanding all the nuances, all the potential risks, and the different scenarios is so important.
So we've laid the groundwork here. We know China's keeping a close eye on how those sanctions played out for Russia, and we know why Taiwan is such a strategic prize. But what moves is China making right now to prepare for potential blowback? That's what I'm really curious about.
Well, that's where we're headed next. We're going to delve into the concrete steps China's taking to safeguard their economy and solidify their position in the region.
It's fascinating stuff, and to be honest, a little unsettling.
Yeah, you could say that again. But it's crucial to understand what's happening. You know, it's striking how China's approaching this from all angles.
Yeah, definitely.
They're not just trying to soften the blow of any potential sanctions. They're looking to actually use this situation to their advantage.
So they see it as like a challenge to overcome, almost an opportunity.
Right, exactly. And it ties into something that came up in that Reddit thread, this idea that sanctions could actually boost domestic production within China.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. Some people argue that it could force them to be more self-reliant. But is that realistic?
It's a complex issue, but there's a certain logic to it. The idea is that if China can't access certain goods or technologies from the West, they'll have to innovate, develop their own alternatives.
So it's like forced evolution, pushing them to be less dependent on the outside world.
Exactly. And we're already seeing signs of this happening. China's been pouring money into key industries like semiconductors, trying to catch up with Taiwan and other major producers.
But I mean, some experts are skeptical that China can just replace Taiwan's chip industry overnight.
Right. And that's understandable. Taiwan's TSMC, the top chip manufacturer globally, has a huge head start. Decades of experience, a level of expertise that's not easily replicated.
So even if China takes control of those facilities, they might not be able to keep up the same level of production.
That's a key point. It's not just about the factories themselves. It's about the people, the knowledge, the entire supply chain that makes Taiwan so successful.
Makes you wonder then, if the economic and tech hurdles are so high, why is China even considering this move? What's in it for them?
Well, that's where the political and strategic calculations come in. For China, Taiwan isn't just about economics or tech. It's about national pride, historical claims, and their goal to be the dominant power in Asia.
So they're willing to risk a lot, potentially face economic pain to achieve those goals.
Seems that way, and that's what makes the situation so unpredictable. China's leadership is playing the long game, and they're not afraid to make bold moves, even if it disrupts the global order.
Okay, so we've covered the economic and political angles. What about the military side of things? That Telegraph article talked about China's resolute countermeasures after the U.S. approved arms shipments to Taiwan. Are we on the verge of actual conflict?
We have to remember that China has always maintained they prefer a peaceful reunification with Taiwan.
Right.
But they've also made it clear that they're not ruling out the use of force.
So it's this delicate dance. They want Taiwan, but they don't want a war with the U.S. But what are these resolute countermeasures they keep mentioning? What could that actually look like?
Tough to say for certain. China's been deliberately vague. But experts think it could range from more military exercises, cyber attacks, to hitting back economically or using diplomatic pressure.
So it's a pretty wide range of possibilities. Anything from a show of force to a full-blown military confrontation. How do we even know which way this is headed? What should we be looking out for?
That's the question everyone wants answered, and it's causing a lot of anxiety. But there are some key things experts are keeping a close eye on.
Lay it on us. What are the red flags?
One of the most obvious is a major ramp-up in Chinese military activity near Taiwan. We're talking large-scale naval exercises, more frequent air incursions, maybe even a buildup of troops and equipment along the coast.
So any unusual military moves could be cause for concern.
Right. Another thing to watch is China's rhetoric. If they start using more aggressive language or issuing ultimatums, that could signal they're losing patience.
So we need to pay attention to both their actions and their words. What about the economic front? Anything there that could tip us off?
Absolutely. If China starts taking drastic measures to protect their economy from potential sanctions, it could mean they're bracing for a serious confrontation. For example, maybe they start rapidly selling off U.S. assets, restricting foreign investment, putting stricter controls on currency exchange.
So if they start acting like they're preparing for a storm, that's a sign to take notice.
Exactly. But it's important to keep in mind that not every move China makes means they're about to invade. They might just be posturing, trying to exert pressure.
So it's all about looking at the context, not just individual incidents.
You got it. Connecting the dots, understanding the big picture. That's where expert analysis, informed discussions like this one are so important.
All right, so we've got a potentially explosive situation brewing, and we need to be vigilant. But let's zoom out for a second and talk about the larger picture. If China does make a move on Taiwan, how would it change the global power dynamic? What kind of world are we looking at?
That's the question everyone's asking, and the answers could be pretty profound. A successful takeover of Taiwan by China would be a game changer, not just in Asia, but globally.
So paint us a picture. What would this new world order look like?
Well, first off, it would cement China as the dominant force in Asia. A clear message to other countries in the region that the U.S. isn't the only big player anymore.
So a major hit to U.S. credibility, their influence around the world.
Definitely. And it could embolden China to act more aggressively in other areas, the South China Sea, trade deals, international institutions.
So a shift in power, with China taking on a much more assertive role. What about the economic implications? We've already talked about potential disruption, but what about the long-term consequences?
Economically, a lot hinges on how the West responds. If they hit China with crippling sanctions, as some are suggesting, it could lead to a period of global instability, maybe even a decoupling of the world economy.
Decoupling, that sounds intense. What does that even mean?
It basically means splitting the world into two separate economic blocks, one led by the West, the other by China. So instead of this interconnected global economy, we'd have two distinct systems, different rules, different currencies, limited interaction.
So the U.S. and China operating in totally separate economic universes, with everyone else forced to pick a side. That sounds like a recipe for tension and instability.
It definitely has that potential, and it's a scenario that a lot of experts think is becoming more likely as things heat up between the U.S. and China.
Wow, this deep dive is really making me think about the choices that are being made right now, both by governments and by individuals. It feels like we're at a crossroads, and the path we choose could have huge consequences.
You're absolutely right. The decisions made in the coming months and years in Beijing and Washington could shape the entire 21st century.
Okay, we've painted a pretty sobering picture here. But what can we as individuals actually do about this? Is there anything we can do to affect the outcome, or are we just passengers?
That's a great question, and I think it needs more attention. While it's easy to feel powerless with these massive global forces at play, there are things individuals can do.
Like what? Give us some ideas.
One of the most important things is to stay informed. Really understand the complexities, the different viewpoints, the potential consequences of different actions.
So don't just skim the headlines or scroll through social media. Go deeper, research, have thoughtful conversations like the one we're having.
Exactly. Another step is to get involved politically. Let your elected officials know you care about this issue and that you want them to prioritize peaceful solutions.
So vote, reach out to your representatives, make your voice heard. What else?
Support organizations that are working to promote dialogue, understanding, peaceful resolution. There are a lot of great groups out there.
And at the end of the day, It's important to remember that this isn't just some abstract geopolitical thing. It's about real people's lives. The
Absolutely.
decisions that governments make directly affect the people of Taiwan, the Chinese people, people all over the world.
That's a crucial point. We have to humanize this. Remember, there are real human costs to conflict. Lives lost, the disruption, the suffering it causes.
Okay, so we have a lot to consider and a lot to do. But I have a feeling we've only just scratched the surface of this whole situation.
You're not wrong. This story is still unfolding, and it's something we'll continue to explore in future episodes.
All right, so everyone listening, buckle up. This deep dive is far from over. But before we move on, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on all this? What questions do you have? What are you taking away from this conversation?
We want this to be a dialogue, not just us talking at you. So share your insights, challenge our assumptions, help us all understand this critical issue better.
It's easy to get lost in all the talk about economics and military strategy, but we can't forget about the human side of all this.
Absolutely, yeah.
There are 23 million people living in Taiwan, and their lives are directly impacted by what happens next.
That's right. It's not just some abstract geopolitical game. It's real people with families, jobs, hopes, dreams. What would an invasion mean for them? What kind of choices would they be forced to make?
It's a powerful reminder that there are actual human beings behind these headlines. We talked about the global economic disruption, but what about the personal disruption, the impact on individual lives?
It's hard to even fathom the level of upheaval an invasion would bring. People fleeing their homes, businesses destroyed, families torn apart. The psychological impact alone would be immense.
And what about the rest of the world? Can other countries do anything to prevent a conflict, or is Taiwan essentially on its own?
Well, that's where things get tricky. The international community is divided on how to approach China. Some countries, particularly in the West, are taking a harder line, upping military support for Taiwan, calling out China's human rights record.
So they're signaling they're not going to sit back and watch if China takes action.
Exactly. But other countries are being more cautious, trying to balance their economic relationships with China with their concerns about these aggressive moves.
Sounds like everyone's walking a tightrope, trying to protect their own interests while navigating this super delicate situation.
That's a good way to put it. And that's why finding a peaceful solution is so difficult. So many competing interests, different perspectives.
Let's say, hypothetically, China does invade. What would that mean for other countries, like ours? What kind of choices would our leaders have to make?
That's the question everyone, especially nations close to Taiwan or the U.S., is wrestling with. Do they intervene militarily and risk a larger conflict with China? Do they slap on economic sanctions, even if it hurts their own economies? Or do they try to remain neutral, hope to avoid being pulled in?
Tough choices, no easy answers. It really highlights the complexity and how far-reaching the consequences could be.
And it reminds us that these decisions made by governments have real-world impacts on people, both at home and around the globe. It's easy to get lost in the theoretical discussions, but we have to remember the human cost of conflict.
Well said. This deep dive has been, to put it mildly, eye-opening. We started with this news story about China studying sanctions, and it's led us to this tangled web of geopolitics, economic uncertainty, and human drama.
It's a lot to take in, but it's crucial that we grapple with these issues, try to understand the forces shaping our world.
You've definitely given our listeners a lot to ponder. This isn't just a story to hear and forget about, it's a call to action. Stay informed, have these tough conversations, consider the potential consequences of the choices we make both individually and as a society.
Couldn't agree more. In a world facing these kinds of complex challenges, informed citizens are more important than ever.
On that note, a huge thank you to you, our expert, for guiding us through this intricate and thought-provoking topic. And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've come away with a better understanding of what's at stake and the seriousness of the decisions ahead.
Remember, the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we all have a hand in creating. So stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.